At my high school graduation, a friend gifted me a book which has followed me in life ever since, a print version of the play, Cyrano de Bergerac, in which the titular character of Cyrano is a golden-tongued poet and a fearsome duelist who's down bad for his cousin and childhood friend, Roxane, but he can't admit his love to her because he's got a bit of a nose. So instead, he tries to romance her by proxy through his handsome but inarticulate and unpoetic friend, Christian. My friend, of course, gifted me this book due to my weird teenage hyperfixation of pointy-nosed folk, and I couldn't be more grateful for it, because like the subjects of my previous videos, the story of Cyrano de Bergerac is constantly being reborn. Cyrano was a real guy in 1600s France. The play, which is a comedic fictionalization of his life, was released in the late 1800s, and since then, he's fallen into legend, continuing to appear in original stories to this day. I haven't seen anyone talking about the entire Cyrano mythos, so I thought, well, it has to be me, doesn't it? When I first conceived this video, it was the man, the myth, the legend, but it felt weird to just dive into an hour-long history talk about some guy from the 17th century. So instead, we're going a little out of order, and I think it'll be a little bit more interesting this way. I'll start by summarizing the plot of the famous play, and then I'll talk about who he really was, and finally I'll talk about everything else. So allow me to present to you Cyrano de Bergerac, the myth, the man, the legend. Before we really get into it, I've got a few disclaimers. First of all, I am not a historian. I'm a hobbyist. I just enjoy talking about the things that I like. But I hate to spread misinformation, so I've tried to do as much research as possible. But let's be real, a good chunk of that is Wikipedia. The information from the 1600s is sparse and written in a manner that can be interpreted in a few different ways. I am 110% biased. I enjoy telling a fun story, and sometimes I interpret things based on vibes, so take my interpretations with a grain of salt. And don't use me as a primary source for your school reports, students. That's what the bibliography is for. In the next section where I summarize the play, I'm going to put some asterisks up on the screen because there's real historical parallels, so pay attention. And hey, if you are a historian familiar with the research gone into anything Cyrano, I would be honored if you add anything you like into the comments. Second, to my French-speaking viewers, je suis désolé. Though my ancestors were once French, that was over 300 years ago. So I'll try my best, but my sincerest apologies up front for butchering the pronunciation of probably every French word and name I'm about to say. Okay, final disclaimer. I'm seconds away from summarizing the entire plot of the play Cyrano de Bergerac, and yes, this will absolutely spoil the plot. If you haven't seen this play, you should see it. It's funny, it's beautiful, it's heartrending, and you can search on YouTube right now and find a bunch of different versions. Also Wikipedia? Hello? If you can find a community version of the play, give that one a watch. Otherwise, I can recommend the American film from 1950 starring José Ferrer, and if you can stand Gerard Depardieu, then the French 1990 film is otherwise flawless. There's also the recent musical with Peter Dinklage and the modern stage revival with James McAvoy. Both are excellent. So give it a watch if you haven't, and once you've done that, or if you've already seen it, we'll move straight along to the myth. The year is 1897, and French playwright Edmond Rostand has just released his play Cyrano de Bergerac, a comedic, romantic tragedy. It starts off in a crowded theater, a play within a play. And as soon as the actor Montfleury takes the stage, the titular character Cyrano appears and berates him with death threats, scaring the actor off the stage. The audience, having paid to see a show, jeer at Cyrano, who challenges anyone brave enough to a duel before throwing his entire month's paycheck to the crowd as repayment for ruining their show. The nobleman Valvert approaches and weakly mocks Cyrano's nose, launching Cyrano into a self-deprecating poem about all of the clever ways one could have used to say the same thing if only Valvert had the wit for it. Valvert, offended, draws his sword on Cyrano, who makes up a poem on the spot during their duel, ending in running Valvert through. Afterwards, Cyrano talks alone with his best friend Henri Lebret, revealing the reason he chased off the actor Montfleury was because he was making eyes at Roxane, Cyrano's childhood friend, cousin, and object of his affections. Lebret tries to convince him to confess his feelings to her, but Cyrano laments that someone as beautiful and clever as Roxane would never agree to be with someone as grotesque as himself. But when her chaperone appears and says that Roxane has invited him to meet with her tomorrow morning, privately, Cyrano is suddenly over the moon, declaring he feels like he could take on an entire army. When their poet friend Linière rushes to them for help, saying that a nobleman has ordered 100 men to kill him because of a scathing poem he wrote, Cyrano, in his ecstatic energy, defends him by slaying all 100 assassins in a single night. The next morning, Cyrano meets privately with Roxane. She first thanks him for getting rid of Valvert, who was vying for her love, and then she confesses to Cyrano that she's in love with someone herself. He's brave, he's noble, he's a soldier, and she knows that he secretly loves her too. And then she hits him with the word, handsome. His name is Christian de Neuvillette, a new soldier in Cyrano's company, made up almost entirely of Gascons, Southerners, known for their bravado and rowdiness, and for their harsh hazing rituals. Roxane asks Cyrano to protect Christian, and he, despite himself, promises that he will. His first day at the barracks, Christian figures he should fight the toughest guy there and learns from the others that would be Cyrano, and that he would do well not to mention his nose. So Christian does just that. Cyrano, enraged, orders everyone out of the room, and, remembering his promise to Roxane, instead of killing Christian, embraces him. He introduces himself as Roxane's cousin, and tells him that she is in love with him. Christian admits that while he's good at attacking men, he's tongue-tied with women, and Cyrano proposes that he write poetry for Christian to give to Roxane. When Christian asks what Cyrano gets out of this deal, he brushes it off, saying he just wants to practice poetry. The nobleman de Guiche, nephew of the powerful Cardinal Richelieu, reveals that he's the one who ordered Ligne's assassination, and Cyrano reveals that he's the one who stopped the assassins. Impressed, de Guiche offers to be Cyrano's patron and see to it that his writings are published. Cyrano declines, launching into his no-thank-you tirade, saying that he would rather live in poverty than ever risk having to censor his writings to suit his rich and powerful patron. Oof. And so, Cyrano gets to write love letters to Roxane, Christian gets to sign his name and deliver them to her, and Roxane gets to believe it's all real. Meanwhile, de Guiche is also trying to woo Roxane, and she isn't having any of it. Christian tries to talk to Roxane without Cyrano's help, and it's a disaster. Then it's the famous balcony scene, a twisted parody of Romeo and Juliet. Roxane upon her balcony, Cyrano and Christian below, with Cyrano whispering lines for Christian to recite to her, until it starts falling apart. Then Cyrano takes Christian's place, confessing his love for her directly in the darkness below in a hushed voice, straight from the heart, leaving Roxane love-struck and Christian dumbfounded. Christian interrupts by asking for a kiss. Roxane accepts, and Cyrano reluctantly helps Christian up to the balcony. A priest arrives with a letter for Roxane from de Guiche, which she reads quietly to herself. He is on his way to force her into marriage tonight. Thinking quickly, Roxane instead tells the priest that the letter says she needs to marry Christian immediately, and asks Cyrano to stall de Guiche in the meantime. Heartbroken at this end result of all of his hard work, Cyrano hides his face and begins the most bizarre scene in the entire play. He jumps down into the street from a tree near de Guiche, speaking in a strange voice claiming to be a moon man who's fallen from the moon. De Guiche initially thinks this man must be drunk, but can't help but get caught up in the fanciful philosophical moon speak. Cyrano finally reveals himself, and when de Guiche makes it to Roxane, she and Christian are already wed. Angered at the turn of events, de Guiche instead announces that Christian and Cyrano are to depart immediately for war. Roxane, distraught at the sudden news, asks Cyrano to protect Christian and to make sure he writes every day, which Cyrano promises to do. The Siege of Arras between France and Spain. Gunshots in the early morning from the Spanish side gets the French soldiers' attention as Cyrano sprints across no man's land, his daily commute across enemy lines to deliver Christian's letters to Roxane. The soldiers are starving, and there's little hope that they will survive the next sortie. Christian interrogates Cyrano about why he risks his life daily to deliver a letter, and why the latest letter he wrote has a tear stain on it, before finally realizing that Cyrano has been in love with Roxane this entire time. When all hope is nearly gone, Roxane and the baker Ragueneau arrive in a carriage with food and water for the soldiers. Roxane and Christian reunite and embrace, and Roxane says it was his words that moved her into action. Christian, having not written a single word to her, asks if she would still love him, even if he were ugly, and she tells him it's his words from the heart that she loves, that she would love him, even if he was grotesque. The battle begins, and Christian tells Cyrano that Roxane loves him, that he needs to tell her the truth, before rushing into the fray. Cyrano tries to tell Roxane the truth, but moments later, Christian is mortally wounded in battle. In Christian's final moments, Cyrano whispers in his ear that he told Roxane the truth, and she still loves only him, and Christian dies. Not wanting to taint the purity of Christian's love, Cyrano swears to himself that he'll take their secret to the grave. It's 15 years later. The widowed Roxane is now a nun, and looks forward to her weekly meeting with her cousin Cyrano, who regularly comes to visit the convent to see her. He's running late this week, and there are whispers of some commotion in town and someone being injured. Cyrano eventually arrives, and they sit and talk, though he seems a bit out of it. He asks to see the final letter Christian gave to her. He begins to read it out loud, then recites it from memory. Roxane realizes this isn't the first time she's hearing this voice reciting to her, before finally realizing that it was Cyrano the entire time. He nearly collapses, and Lebray and Ragueneau rush to his side to reveal that there had been an assassination attempt on him. A beam of wood was dropped onto his head, and he left his deathbed because he wanted to see her one more time. In his final moments, Cyrano confesses his love to Roxane, and through tears, Roxane says she loved only one man, and has now lost him twice. As Cyrano dies, he brings one thing with him: Mon panache. The play opened to massive success and played daily for over a year before touring Europe, eventually spreading worldwide. It spawned books, operas, films, even video games. Its popularity with the masses guaranteed a contrary opinion from some critics who accused it of lowering the French taste and compromising French national dignity. You see, at the time, theater was at a turning point, and the more cerebral and experimental plays might have seemed a bit dull to the average theater-goer until Cyrano leapt onto the stage with his cape and sword and boundless energy. These same critics accused Rostand of being a right-wing nationalist because of the traditional storytelling and historical subject matter, despite Rostand having socialist leanings. In spite of these critics, and because of the play's brilliance and popularity, Cyrano became part of the French national identity: courage, valiance, wit, panache. The final line brought the word panache into the English language to mean not its original French meaning of plume, the decorative feather worn in hats, but what it represented in the play, a sense of pride, bravado, and style. In Rostand's own words, a little frivolous perhaps, most certainly a little theatrical, panache is nothing but a grace which is so difficult to retain in the face of death. A grace which demands so much strength that, all the same, it is a grace which I wish for all of us. Alright, let's get to it. The nose. In order to exaggerate Cyrano's grotesqueness, the actor traditionally wears a ridiculous prosthetic nose, which I personally find distracting, which I think is a shame. I think it distracts from the genuine humanity of the story. I get it. Not only is it a comedy, it's also supposed to be a metaphor for how we feel about our own perceived imperfections. I'm not saying that every Cyrano actor has to be as easy on the eyes as James McAvoy, though I wouldn't complain too loudly. But it feels more real when it's not as obvious, or, in Peter Dinklage's case, when it's something that the actor has probably had to deal with in their actual lives. After all, we all have a nose somewhere. While one side to the play is inspiring self-reflection, the real standout part of the play is the character of Cyrano himself. He's brave, he's bombastic, he's rebellious, he's romantic, he's wrathful, he's panache personified. But as brave as he is, he's also a coward. He's selfish. He isn't a hero. He says the one thing that could destroy him is Roxane's rejection, and so he only worships her from afar, hurting her in the process. A personal peeve of mine, there's almost always a pretty significant age difference between the actors that play Cyrano and Roxane, despite the fact that they're supposed to be of similar age, because they were kids together. One reason for this is because when Rostand wrote the play, he had a specific actor in mind to play Cyrano, Coquelin, who was already in his late 50s. And I mean, obviously you can't have a beautiful female love interest over the age of 40, right? There's a historical caveat to this one too. Let's come back to this topic in roughly 45 minutes. Listen, there's plenty of in-depth analyses of this play out there on all of the characters and their motivations, and I could go on forever, but we haven't even gotten to the main focus of the video. For the sake of tradition, after seeing the play for the first time, you need to say the following line. This Cyrano guy, what a character. Wait, he was real? You knew this, I told you at the start of the video. After growing up reading Cyrano's stories and the legends about him, Rostand simply wanted to make a play about his childhood hero, one that he felt that the French public needed. But how accurately did he depict him? Everyone had to know. There's no way that a man this fiery, this talented, this outrageous actually existed. Thus the play ignited an international interest into the real life of Cyrano de Bergerac, the man. Let's get this out of the way. I mean, he's French. Listen, I can say that because I was made fun of as a kid for my nose. I wonder if that had any lasting effect on my psyche. I guess we'll never know. This is the one portrait of him that was done during his lifetime, and all other portraits were derived from this one, so this really is all we have. I always thought that, like Cyrano's nose, Rostand was also exaggerating everything else in his life. But if you thought the play was tragic, just wait until you hear about the man's real life. It has affected me more than I care to admit. I don't have any notes here, let's just get to it. On March 6, 1619, in Paris, Savignon de Cyrano II is baptized. This is the closest date we know to the day he was born. He's arrived nearly 3 centuries too early to watch his own play. Yes, he's born in Paris, not the town of Bergerac in southern France. His family is nouveau noble, newly upper middle class as of his grandfather and namesake, Savignon de Cyrano I. The family owns 2 estates in the Parisian suburb of Saint-Fulgé. The 2 estates are named Mauvier and the adjoined farm Bergerac. It is here that the family settle when Savignon is a child, and he meets who would be his lifelong friend and eventual biographer, Henri Lepré. Yes, that's the same Lepré from the play, the one who tries to talk some sense into Cyrano. For the sake of future context, unlike our Savignon de Cyrano, whose namesake was a Protestant and household were not terribly devout, Henri Lepré comes from a very pious Catholic family, and this will be very relevant later. As for his family, Savignon is the middle child. He has an older brother Denis, 2 older siblings that died very young, a little brother Abel II, and finally his little sister Catherine. And yes, he really suffered from middle child syndrome. Young Savignon's childhood will have a great effect on his attitude and philosophy for the rest of his life. His father, Abel de Cyrano I, was an old man, already in his 50s when Savignon was born. His library was well stocked with Greek mythology and philosophy, and curiously, no French language Bibles. As soon as Savignon was able to read, he was sent off to a boarding school taught by a countryside priest, and since he was already so precocious and such a voracious reader, Savignon was then a handful for his teacher, who he regularly disagreed with. As Lepré reflects on their shared childhood at the boarding school, he writes that Savignon summarized the priest as a pedantic asshole. It's not unlikely that he would have faced beatings from this priest for his insolence. As Lepré puts it,
"The education we had received together at the home of a good country priest who kept small boarders had made us friends from our earliest youth. And I remember the aversion he had from that time onward for the priest because he thought that this man was a bit of a pedant. Savignon cared so little for the priest's lessons and his corrections that his father, who was an older gentleman and rather indifferent to the education of his children and too credulous to his son's complaints, withdrew him a little too abruptly, and, without inquiring whether his son would be better off somewhere else, sent him to Paris, where he left him to his own devices until he was 19.
And so, Savignon, around the age of 13, was sent off to the big city to live with an uncle. Imagine being a clever, upper-middle-class teenage boy who just moved to the big city without any parental supervision. Do you think Savignon was attending his classes like a good boy? As Lepré puts it, he fell into the tavern life, drinking and gambling, and it wouldn't have been unheard of for him to visit brothels. Regardless, he frequently wrote to his father asking for money to clear his debts. You see, Savignon is a natural libertine, a hedonistic freethinker, a-religious, questioning all of the authority and social norms around him. Add to this the fact that throughout his entire life, his number one enemy will be the concept of absolute truth. He celebrates and thrives in the gray areas and will never accept "that's just the way it is" as an answer for anything. And this for sure rubbed people the wrong way in 1600s France. The Age of Enlightenment hadn't quite gotten off the ground yet. René Descartes wouldn't say cogito ergo sum until Savignon was already 18. So his own offbeat beliefs and passionate, fiery vocalism undoubtedly left an impression on those around him. Things are a bit blurry during Savignon's Paris education. Historians can't agree, but it's possible he attended the College of Beauvais, where he would have found yet another pedantic and cruel teacher. We assume he attended because he'll later write a comedic play, Le Pedant Jouet, about the principal of the school who would have been his abuser. Facing mistreatment and disillusionment from his education, he likely quit school. His father, then in his 70s, sold the estates Mauvier and Bergerac, thus losing the family's already loose nobility status, and the whole family moved back to Paris. After finding out how the teenaged Savignon had been spending his time and money and had quit school, his father threatened to cut him off financially. Lebray pats himself on the back, recalling that he likely saved Sauvignon from going down a dark path by smoothing things over between him and his father. Unlike Sauvignon, Lebray has finished his studies, having studied law, and his father wants him to join the military, so Lebray convinces the now 19-year-old Sauvignon to enlist with him. It was common then for the second oldest son to join the military. At the same time, Sauvignon's big brother Denis will enter priesthood, followed by their little sister Catherine becoming a nun a couple years later, both funded by their parents. And from this point onward, I'm going to be referring to Sauvignon as Cyrano, as he's now a soldier. The way Lebray tells it, their entire company is made up of Gascons, soldiers from southern France who are full of machismo and bravery. The cadets of Gascony are legendary all on their own. At the very least, their company officer, Carbon de Casteljaloux, is Gascon, and I get the feeling that this man made a big impression on Cyrano, likely the first real father figure in his life, adopting some of the man's mannerisms, to the point where even some of Cyrano's contemporaries were convinced Cyrano was from the south. This is pure conjecture, but I would not be surprised if, upon telling his Gascon captain the small lie that his family owns the estates of Mauvier and Bergerac, and making the connection between the name of the estate and the name of the southern French town, Casteljaloux could have been the first to call him Cyrano de Bergerac. Cyrano the Parisian quickly proves himself worthy of being in Casteljaloux' regiment by being incredibly gifted at winning sword fights. Lebray recalls he won a duel for every day he was in the military, and that their fellow soldiers started calling him the demon of bravery. But Lebray also paints a very different picture of Cyrano during this time too.
I saw him one day in the guardhouse working on an elegy with as little distraction as if he'd been in a study far from the noise.
At the age of 20, during a siege in Mousson, a shot from a musket passed entirely through his body, and somehow he survived. A year later, at the age of 21, against the Spanish at the siege of Arras, that's the one from the play, the fight came down to swords, and unexpectedly, he lost, receiving a Spanish sword to the throat. And again, somehow, he survived. But this wound would end his military career. And so he returns to Paris, to civilian life, and to his studies for real this time. He starts studying rhetoric at the College of Lisieux. We know this for a fact because we have a written document about Cyrano's life that Lebray doesn't provide for some reason or another. I'll spare you the 17th century legalese and summarize it for you. Sauvignon de Cyrano, a student of rhetoric at the College of Lisieux, accompanied by his mother Espérance Bélanger, agrees to pay all expenses and damages as a result of the assault to the victim, a sum of 30 livres, 15 of which go to the victim, and 15 to the surgeon who bandaged him. The lady also recognizes that her son Cyrano's sword was returned to him. 22-year-old Cyrano, the brave demon, wounded and traumatized war veteran, skewered a fellow student, and his mom had to come bail him out. 4 months later, likely as a direct result of this incident, Cyrano commits himself to 2 years of fencing classes under one of Paris's weapons masters in order to learn fighting discipline and to sharpen his skills. He also commits himself to 2 years of dance classes. These were both bankrolled by his father and almost certainly insisted upon by his mother in order for him to learn civilian rules of fencing and to soften his rough edges into a refined gentleman. But really, it's just going to make him unstoppable. The one element from the play that everyone assumes must be made up, even more than the nose, is of course the legendary duel against 100 men. As the popular legend goes, Cyrano's friend and satirical poet Linière managed to insult a powerful nobleman who hired 100 thugs to teach him a lesson. As some versions go, this nobleman chose such a high number of thugs specifically because he knew Linière was friends with the demon of bravery. Linière, having been warned of the planned assault, can't return home through the Porte de Nesle, so he goes to Cyrano to stay the night with him. Instead, Cyrano offers to escort him home and even invites a couple of friends just to watch the action. When they approach the gate, Cyrano manages to fend off an entire crowd of hitmen by himself. The details have been long debated, likely since the day it happened, but Lebray states this much as a fact. 100 men gathered to insult one of his friends at the Porte de Nesle, and as witnessed by 2 of his friends, Cyrano killed 2, wounded 7, and scared the rest off. Most historians allow that it was probably just a large crowd and not literally 100. Regardless, this singular event is held up as proof of Cyrano's legendary sword fighting skills. You might say that scaring off most of a crowd isn't as impressive as killing them all, but hopefully we can agree that it's the better outcome. Shortly after, the 2 friends that witnessed the legendary duel passed the story on to the nobleman Jean de Gassion, who was so struck by Cyrano's skill and bravery that he would extend an offer to have Cyrano work for him. The 2 likely would have been a good pair as they were of similar attitude. However, Cyrano valued his freedom more than anything, and declined. The next hard document we have about Cyrano's life comes 4 years later and is one that's often discussed in any Cyrano biography: the secret illness. In 1645, Cyrano signs an agreement to repay a surgeon for having treated, bandaged, medicated, and cured him of a secret illness from which he was suffering, as well as having fed him, housed him, and provided him with everything he needed. It's never been determined what this secret illness was. Two of Cyrano's historians, Lacroix and Lachèvre, suggest this might have been syphilis. Another Cyrano historian, Dr. Madelina Alcover, suggests it might have been a urinary disease from his military wounds. An editor from the French Wikipedia article suggests that it could have been from a stab wound, linking it to an incident that happened that same year where a group of Cyrano's friends, including his close friend Jean Royer de Prade, were involved in a quarrel in front of the palace where 2 men were killed. Cyrano's friends were arrested, and everyone else fled. Thus they're proposing that Cyrano was involved, got a particularly bad stab wound, and had to see a surgeon about it, but had to keep it secret because he would have been on the run from the cops. Add to this the fact that 3 years later the debt will be paid not by Cyrano, but by one of de Prade's friends. It certainly sounds likely, and Cyrano was frequently chosen as a backup fighter for his friends for obvious reasons. As Cyrano himself writes,
"I have been everyone's second."
As in backup in a duel, not the love thing you're probably thinking. In any case, Cyrano signs the document not as Savagnin de Cyrano, but as Alexandre de Cyrano-Bergerac. This is significant for a few reasons. We're not sure why he signed it this way. It could have been added insurance if he really was on the run from the cops, or maybe he would have tried to weasel his way out of paying by saying, "Well, that's not my name." Instead, he picks the name of his former captain, or perhaps another hero of his, Alexander the Great. Most interestingly, he also tacks on Bergerac at the end. If he's acknowledging that as the second son, he skips over the main estate of Mauvier and goes straight for the second estate Bergerac to imply nobility, he's completely ignoring the fact that his family sold the estates nearly a decade prior and would therefore not legally be allowed to call himself that. But that won't stop him. It's also possible he was just playing with the idea of his name at the time. As I'll talk about later, Cyrano was never terribly attached to the name his family gave him. By this time, Cyrano will have fallen into a close-knit circle of rascals known as les libertins, the libertines, bohemian freethinkers with dangerous and sexy ideas for the 1600s. This during a time when public executions for blasphemy were not unheard of. Finally, Cyrano found the intellectual counterculture community he'd been looking for. They were poets, writers, philosophers, proto-scientists. They discussed alchemy, Descartes, Campanella, Epicureanism, and the trial of Galileo. They questioned the church, questioned contemporary social conventions, flirted with atheism and homoeroticism, with just enough ciphering, sarcasm, and self-censorship to keep themselves out of prison. They were taught by the philosopher Gassendi, and they regarded themselves as a small secret society. But above all, they talked about how oppressed and hated they were by the greater Baroque society. And oppressed perhaps they were. In her historical analysis, Libertine Strategies, Joan de Jonc describes the obstacles they would have faced, such as difficulties getting their written works published due to their esoteric subject matter, whose blasphemous contents could be dangerous, even for the publisher who printed it. But she also notes that this oppression is central to the identity of the libertine writer, and almost certainly feeds into a certain kind of egotism. Regardless, anytime one of them successfully got the rights to get a work published, everyone else in the group would pile in with introductory poems on the author, the subject matter, or even the reader themselves. In Charles Coypel de Saucy's 1648 The Judgment of Paris, before a handful of introductory poems by his libertine friends, there appeared a sarcastic notice to the reader. I'll paraphrase. "Listen, O vulgar one, headless and heartless monster, don't even bother trying to read this book. You won't get it. The author is way too clever for you, and it'll probably just piss you off. Alas, if only all of the ignorant people in the world had but one head, then I could be the Hercules of Bergerac." As in, Cyrano signs it Hercule de Bergerac. This is the first time we see him fully use the de Bergerac surname, with the de particle included, suggesting nobility that he, again, did not have. It's around this time that Cyrano, now a student of philosophy with a more humanistic outlook, starts putting away the sword and picks up the pen. But there's much commentary on Cyrano's dualistic nature. In her biography, The Life and Legend of Cyrano de Bergerac, Ishbel Adiman writes, while he could be antagonistic, angry, and difficult, he could also be charming, funny, and loyal.
You are a study in contradictions. You are temperate and intemperate. A cynical idealist, a righteous sinner, a hopeful pessimist. You love peace, and yet you have slain so many.
This notice to the reader would be the first of Cyrano's writings to be published at the age of 29. It's because of this humorous notice that sometimes Cyrano's full name is presented as Hercule Savinien Cyrano de Bergerac, because Rostand was taking him seriously. I hope you noticed that now he's associated himself with two Greek heroes, Alexander and Hercules. In case you couldn't tell from his portraits where he's clad in robes instead of whatever they were wearing then, Cyrano is a massive Greekaboo. This bitch loves Greek mythology, and will reference the stories any chance he gets. They even put a little laurel crown on his head. Posthumously. It's these years that Cyrano is in and out of debt, as he struggles to keep up with rent payments and money for food, paper, quills, ink. He moves around a lot, probably couch surfs at his friends' places. Being a creative who doesn't want to be bound by either corporate interests or the interests of noblemen will unfortunately and inevitably lead to a bit of the starvation and homelessness, whether it's the 1600s or today. I personally believe that anyone who participates in one of the king's sexy little wars and becomes so injured they can no longer be a soldier, they should at least have a roof over their head and food on their tables for the rest of their lives, straight from the royal treasury, but what the fuck do I know? We're not sure when or how, but sometime before 1648, Cyrano's mother Espérance and big brother Denis passed away. After the death of his big brother, Cyrano was now the oldest son, and after the death of his mother, Cyrano along with his little brother may have assisted with the caretaking of his elderly and possibly senile father, despite the fact that the two never particularly saw eye to eye. And in January 1648, at around the age of 80, Cyrano's father Abel died, vaguely accusing in his will that one of his two remaining sons was stealing from him, but he wasn't sure which one. Afterwards, Cyrano at one point calls himself the Lord of Bergerac, and if you think it's just our Cyrano playing these silly name games, Abel Jr., figuring that since his big brother is taking the name of the smaller estate, starts adding de Mauvier to his own name. Both of these despite the fact that, again, their family hasn't owned these estates for over a decade now, and much later, Abel will be fined 300 livres for impersonating nobility. If Cyrano mourned at all, his spirits would soon be lifted, for just 2 months later, Parisian booksellers began selling the French translation of Francis Godwin's proto-science fiction novel, The Man in the Moon. I don't know if you've ever read a book that would end up completely changing the course of your life, but this is how I imagine it must have been for Cyrano, as he would start writing his own first novel in response to it. Sure enough, shortly afterwards, a manuscript starts circulating amongst his libertine friends, who love it. It goes by a few different names: L'Autrement, The Other World, States and Empires of the Moon, or simply Voyage to the Moon, which for the sake of simplicity is what I'll be calling it for the rest of this video. Listen, it isn't a proper Cyrano biography if I don't mention his friendships, because even the devout Lebret will be sure to mention Cyrano's great restraint towards the fairer sex. I mentioned de Saussure a little bit ago, the one that Monsieur Hercule de Bergerac wrote the funny introduction for. It isn't clear when Cyrano would have met de Saussure, who was 15 years his senior. It's possible he met him at a tavern when Cyrano was still a teenager, but it's for sure he knew him post-military. De Saussure is described as a charming poet and musician, manipulating his way in and out of high society and prison sentences. He could probably smell the daddy issues coming off of Cyrano. The two were very close friends for many years. De Saussure will later take credit for introducing Cyrano to atheism, the libertine way of thinking, as well as vaguely imply his sexual education. The vibe I get from their relationship is one of power imbalance, where the strong-willed Cyrano will always fight against the older and more knowledgeable de Saussure. Their relationship was extremely turbulent. Adiman does not mince words about the man. De Saussure was a sexual predator who targeted vulnerable young men and even boys. And after poring through all of the analyses I've read on him, even the man's own words, I'm entirely inclined to agree with her. Cyrano was also apparently roommates with another libertine, Claude Emmanuel Lullier, also known as Chapelle, who was approximately 5 years younger than Cyrano. These three libertines, Cyrano, de Saussure, and Chapelle, would make up what Dr. Alcover called the gay trio. De Saussure would later reflect on their relationship thusly: "When Cyrano introduced me to Chapelle, he'd already been eating his bread and wearing out his sheets." And if you're taking this text at face value, it's important to note that de Saussure called himself the Emperor of Burlesque. Maybe he really was only saying Cyrano was Chapelle's house guest, but de Saussure will live to a ripe old age because, like any good libertine, he writes in double entendre. Obviously they couldn't out themselves, it would have been a death sentence in their time, but much later de Saussure and Chapelle will grow increasingly bold in their letters to and about each other, with less and less subtlety about their respective sexualities, and they'll drag Cyrano into it. Another late criticism, this time directed at Linière, will accuse him of living an abnormal lifestyle, a profane monkhood of which Cyrano was the teacher. Regardless, it's generally well accepted now that Cyrano was at least some flavor of gay, or maybe bisexual, with even the Cyrano Museum in Bergerac confirming it. And we haven't even gotten to the stuff that Cyrano himself wrote. Don't worry, we will get there. But a few years later, there's a spectacular breakup of the gay trio. No one knows what incident initially sparked it, but speculations of course abound. The eternally volatile Cyrano writes a few letters, one accusing Chapelle of plagiarism.
You know that I'm a revenger of wrongs and am very much inclined to distributive justice.
And another two titled Against an Ingrate and Contra Societas, or Against De Saussy with the letters of De Saussy's name ciphered.
You're so foul that when we see you, we doubt whether your mother didn't give birth to you through her ass. I've heard you pray to God to give you so much grace as to not believe in him. Oh heavens, chastiser of heresies, punish this one with thunder. I have loved you and given up my heart as an offering to you. It seems then you thought me so foolish, like giving my soul to the devil out of charity. You have the impudence to eat and drink as if you were not dead. Ha! I vow I will so annihilate you that it shall not be true to say that you ever lived. No, I am inexorable. 'Tis resolved you shall die, and soon.
And then he signs with, your judge, your jury, your executioner. If Cyrano's fighting style is anything like his writing style, I can see why he was such a good swordsman. Because when he doesn't like someone, not only will he write an entire essay about them, he goes for the throat, and he doesn't let go. Cyrano will also write an equally scathing letter against one of De Saussy's friends, Scarron, who in turn will summarize Cyrano as a man who does everything possible, whether he loves or hates, and calls Cyrano one of the most despicable men in France. Much later, the trio will dissolve even more, for then there'll only be a duo, with Chapelle accusing De Saussy of being a pederast, and De Saussy accusing Chapelle of being a slut, while implying that it was Cyrano that gave Chapelle his sexual education. At one point or another, they'll have all accused each other of various STIs. Let's look at what De Saussy said about why Cyrano was mad at him. De Saussy attempts to lead us to believe that his quarrel with Cyrano was the result of a misunderstanding over a roast capon, which he hid under his bed when he heard a knock at the door. The person at the door was none other than Cyrano, and when he smelled the savory dish and saw the table set, he felt that he had been personally affronted by De Saussy's deliberate lack of hospitality. His violent temper erupted, and before De Saussy could explain, Cyrano had stamped out of the apartment. The following day, he returned carrying a dueling pistol case. De Saussy assumed that Cyrano had come to challenge him to a duel, and without waiting for an explanation, fled the quarters. As doubtful as this explanation is, I like the detail of Cyrano showing up with dueling pistols. This is literally the only time I've ever seen anyone suggest Cyrano even owned dueling pistols. But the implication is that Cyrano, knowing old man De Saussy would never hope to defeat him in a sword fight, brings pistols to give the man a fighting chance. That even though he has vowed to execute this man, he still has a sense of honor. In any case, Cyrano won't get the chance to pursue his death threat, as De Saussy will flee Paris and will later say,
The late de Bergerac was right to want to kill me.
Around this time, Cyrano signs his name 3 different ways in a single document in an agreement to repay a baker he lived with for back pay for rent and cakes. I think this is him still playing with the idea of his name. I don't particularly think he enjoyed the idea of being Savagnon, the second of his name. It seems like he dropped it as quickly as he could. He appears quite taken with his family name, which he has now adopted as a pseudo first name. He also seems taken with the name de Bergerac, with its dual implications of Gascony and nobility, and for sure, in the future, his friends will nearly always refer to him as Monsieur de Bergerac. The surname Cyrano has Italian and Greek origins, which makes sense as Cyrano's paternal ancestors were from Sardinia. In Libertine Strategies, Dijon discusses the reasoning behind why Cyrano kept changing his name, defying his familial ties he was born with in favor of always wearing a mask, always shifting and changing. It certainly wasn't uncommon among his libertine friends to abandon their birth names for a pen name. Cyrano's friend François Lamitte more frequently used the name Tristan Lamitte in reference to the man of the same name who lived 2 centuries prior. De Saussy and Chapelle are also only artist names, names that they chose for themselves over the names they were given by their families. Perhaps for the libertines, this may have been done out of a need for anonymity, as their skeptical viewpoints would have been forbidden by the society they lived in. But I think more likely it was out of a desire for self-creation, to cast off the family chains who likely disagreed with their lifestyles, and to instead create themselves. It's 1653, and Cyrano's friends want him to publish Voyage to the Moon, as he's now working on a sequel, Voyage to the Sun. But all of them, including Cyrano, are concerned about censorship, or worse, punishment, for the apparent blasphemy in the novel. They implore him to befriend a nobleman who will defend him in court should anything go wrong, as knowing someone rich and powerful would help smooth over any legal issues. It also wouldn't hurt to earn a real paycheck for once. He's in his mid-30s now, and it's about time he gets his life together. Tragically, de Gassion died 6 years prior, so Cyrano can no longer take him up on his offer. At the behest of his friends, Cyrano finally sets aside his pride and his freedom and seeks out a patron in the Duc d'Apajon. Not much is known about what Cyrano's responsibilities were in the Duke's household. It's assumed he was a secretary and possibly a guard. There isn't much from him from that period, aside from a sonnet written for the Duke's daughter, and a poem he wrote about one of the Duke's lavish parties, giving a sense of feeling out of place in this rich man's house. In December, he receives permission and funding from his patron to have some of his works published the next year. It's likely a rough transition for him, but things are finally starting to look up. For some reason, I feel the need to talk about something lighthearted. So let's do that. April 1654 saw the publication of 2 of Cyrano's works, like his tragic play, The Death of Agrippina. It apparently sold very well, because it was really controversial. In particular, the line, "The gods who did not create man, but were created by man." Okay, something more lighthearted. The letters. Cyrano published a collection of his letters, short observational essays, either about nature, or about people he liked, or people he really didn't like. The first 4 letters are about the 4 seasons, against winter, for spring, for summer, and finally, against autumn. The first one, Against Winter, focuses on how much he despises the cold, and in pure satirical schoolboy humor, he opens with a penis joke.
Mine is so shrunk into itself that for whatever reason I touch myself today, I grasp at nothing.
For as much as he hates the cold, he adores the sun. In For Summer, he refers to it as a god, saying that,
He sends the birds to greet us with their music, and he warms our baths. He is so taken with our beauty that he endeavors to see us naked. He cools his rays in water so that he may kiss us without burning us.
A pair of letters are about the then newly built Acaille Aqueduct to bring more clean drinking water to Paris. In them, he elegantly describes the long dance the water does as it twirls and spins down from the hills, bumping into turns and edges along the way, only to end with it pissing into the mouths of the citizens of Paris. One letter, titled For Sorcerers, addresses his society's fear of evil magic. I assume a friend lent him a book on the topic, and he wrote this letter after reading it. In it, he crafts a fanciful story where he goes for a walk in the woods and happens upon a broom, which starts flying and whisks him off to a mystical desert where he watches a sorcerer perform a witch's sabbath. The description of events becomes more and more diabolical as the letter goes on, until he's safely dropped back home in his bed. In its sequel, Against Sorcerers, he opens by asking, "Tell me truly, did my last letters scare you?" Then goes on about the ridiculousness of believing in evil magic and witches' sabbaths, that more innocent people have been tortured and burned at the stake because they were scared into admitting to something they never did, that the only true evil in the world are these cruel and unjust practices. The open-mindedness he displays in this letter is striking for anyone from the 17th century.
Only Reason is my queen, to whom I willingly subscribe.
He also published some of his love letters, and unfortunately we don't know who any of the recipients would have been, as all of the names of the recipients have been replaced with Madame. One of them is a particularly passionate letter to a redhead, but my favorite is the one where he mentions having enjoyed a bit of masochism.
But however ill you intend, I so confound in my joy everything that comes from you, that the hands that strike me or stroke me are alike welcome, provided they be yours. And this letter that I send to you is a proof of it, since it is only to give you thanks for tying my wrists, for pulling my hair, and, by all this violence, for having made me, Madame, your servant.
In The Duelist, he laments how much he's been called out to duel lately.
If all mankind had but one head, if of all the living were left but one, that would surely be yet another duel for me to fight. I almost fancy sometimes that I am become a porcupine, since nobody comes near me without being pricked. My hand hath so peopled hell, that the devil spews the souls up again upon the earth. 'Tis indeed a great consolation to me to be hated, because I am beloved. To find enemies everywhere, because I have friends in all places.
Okay, one more. On the shadows of trees in the water. In this one, he recalls laying by the side of a river on his belly in the shade of a willow tree, observing the reflection of the trees in the water, and the fish swimming through the inverted woods. Cyrano clearly loved nature. I think he really looked forward to finally leaving the big city and retiring to the countryside someday. Yeah. Yeah. Something happened at the start of 1654, and we're not really certain what. The popular theory really is a beam of wood was dropped on his head, either by accident or on purpose. Leplay is strangely vague about it, calling it merely a blow to the head, without any further details about how it happened. And for the longest time, this was accepted as the reality, if with maybe a hint of doubt. Other alternative theories suggest maybe he really did have syphilis and it finally got to his brain. After all, everyone around him was calling him a madman. Whatever the cause, is this not ultimately the eventual fate of the undefeatable duelist, to die by some freak accident or by illness? Well, further research found this beam of wood theory didn't appear until a good 35 years after Cyrano's death, in a dictionary of all places. If anything, it sounds like it was just embellishment on what Leplay wrote, with no new information. And then, over 300 years later, there was an explosion of research into Cyrano's life. Long years of scouring the French National Archives for any mention of Savinien de Cyrano de Bergerac, his family, his friends, his enemies, anyone who would have known him. This research yielded most of the information I brought to you in this video. One peculiar piece of information came straight from Cyrano's own pen, an unpublished letter from his manuscripts titled "Against a Murderous and Slandering Jesuit." In it, he states that a priest has put out a hit on him, and he calls the man a coward for not doing his own dirty work. He then goes on to mock the man, stating that he must think of Cyrano as a king, as there was already a failed attempt on his life where his would-be assassin tried to kill him in the same manner as the assassination of King Henry IV of France. That is, by carriage ambush. From her Cyrano biography, Adiman adds, Cyrano also points out the notable hypocrisy in the Jesuits preaching a doctrine of justifiable homicide to his followers. Another of Cyrano's accusations against the priest is that he is guilty of sexually abusing the pupils in his charge. In the 1640s in France, there were indeed Jesuit priests, such as Niccolo Baldelli, who may or may not be the same Nicholas B. to whom Cyrano's harangue is addressed, openly preaching the astonishing doctrine that murder was acceptable in certain circumstances to save one's honor. The libertine's frequent talk of being pursued by enemies was often interpreted as being overblown, so this easily could have been dismissed as a dramatic cry for attention from Cyrano. However, this scouring of the French National Archives brought forth insight from the strangest of sources: a newspaper written entirely in rhyme. On January 10th, 1654, there's mention of the Duc d'Apajon. By the light of the moon, in the early days of the new year, the Duke's carriage, traveling late at night, was attacked. One of the horses was killed, one of the Duke's guards was thrown to the ground, and was then mortally wounded, shot with a short-barreled musket. The word to describe the shot, coup, is the same word Leplay uses to describe the blow to Cyrano's head, which is what's particularly vague. This can be either understood as a blow to the head, but it can also be understood as shot in the head, as Leplay uses the same word to describe the musket shot that Cyrano received in the military. Dr. Alcover asserted that this had to have been Cyrano, that it fits perfectly into the timeline of events. Sure enough, January the 3rd, 1654, was a full moon. Dr. Alcover acknowledged that this is circumstantial evidence. I acknowledge that this is circumstantial evidence. This feels like the truth. In my heart, this is the truth. I have not seen a single person present the beam of wood theory without immediately following it up with, but honestly I think he was assassinated. Add to this the fact that Lacroix mentioned that despite the apparent popularity of Cyrano's works having been reprinted several times, the stark lack of surviving copies is suspicious, and he presents a theory that a good volume of Cyrano's books may have been burned. Now I hear you asking, but Ray, didn't Cyrano get exactly what he deserved? Was he not also practicing the doctrine that murder is acceptable to save one's honor? And to that I say, regardless of whether Cyrano dueled to protect his honor or to protect his friends' lives, Cyrano never claimed to be a holy man. He never had a congregation, he was not in a position of power, and he certainly would have never paid someone else to kill someone for him. We don't know what happened afterwards. Only Leplay mentioning that he was abandoned by Duc d'Apajon and taken to his brother Abel, and something Leplay refers to as Cyrano's long captivity. Whether he was held by Abel, as a censored line from Leplay will mention Abel keeping Cyrano in chains, or committed to a hospital or prison or asylum, we don't know. Whatever it wasn't pretty. It wasn't until Cyrano's friends started wondering where he was that they found him, rescued him, and took him to the house of a charitable nobleman who housed and cared for Cyrano for over a year. Regardless of how it happened, the simple fact is Cyrano spent the rest of his life slowly dying from traumatic brain injury. Le Bray visited his bedside regularly to work with him to finally publish Voyage to the Moon and its sequel Voyage to the Sun. The fact that this man was still writing even after his injury, that he was still lucid through it all, putting on a brave face, slowly declining over 19 months, fills me with an unbearable melancholy. In fact, it's because of his apparent lucidity that biologist Dr. Rita Benko rules out neurosyphilis, which would have surely given him dementia, blindness, and paralysis, and would have left him unable to continue writing. Despite dealing with what must have been severe headaches, dizziness, and nausea at the very least, Le Bray writes that Cyrano did his best to stay in good humor throughout it. What was it Rostand said about the definition of panache? A grace which is so difficult to retain in the face of death, a grace which demands so much strength. Le Bray writes that Cyrano was only sad that he didn't have more time, that he couldn't do more with his life. Le Bray requested some nuns to visit to keep him company, and to make sure he died a good Christian. One of these nuns was none other than his third cousin, Madeleine Robineau, the inspiration for Roxane. Despite there usually being a pretty wide age gap between the Cyrano and Roxane actors, Madeleine is actually 10 years older than the real Cyrano. She married not Christian, but Christophe de Neuvillette, who, like his play's counterpart, also died at the siege of Arras. It's not impossible that Christophe and Cyrano may have met at the siege, though, as a noble, Christophe was cavalry, and Cyrano was infantry. When her husband died, she became a nun. Le Bray speaks very positively about how Cyrano renounced his libertine ways, but this is heavily doubted by generally everyone. It simply doesn't suit Cyrano's spirit. Whether it was that he found the visiting nuns irritating, or that he wanted to get some good country air, or just to finally get some goddamned peace and quiet, in July of 1655, Cyrano felt the void calling, and left Paris to stay with his cousin, Pierre de Cyrano, in Saint-Ouen. 5 days later, on July 28, 1655, Savinien de Cyrano de Bergerac was dead. He was 36 years old. He was the same age as me. Obviously, having never met the man, the local parish priest calls Cyrano a good Christian, and he was buried the next day at the local church. Le Bray will then devote himself entirely to religious services as soon as his best friend is gone. It's difficult not to wonder if it isn't out of a similar sentiment as Madeleine becoming a nun after the death of Christophe. 2 years later, a book will appear on Parisian bookshelves. The written works of the 17th century French libertines were mainly semi-autobiographical accounts of their experiences as libertines, often as travelogues. There's an overarching theme of alienation, as they feel incompatible with and othered by their society or the society they travel through. Voyage to the Moon is also presented as a travelogue told in first person, but unlike the works of his fellow libertines, Cyrano's novel is science fiction, heavily inspired by Godwin's The Man in the Moon. The preface to Voyage to the Moon includes the only biography of Cyrano written by someone who knew him. Le Bray's biography is vague and romanticized, but for centuries it was the only information we had. The narrator is not named in Voyage to the Moon, but in its sequel, Voyage to the Sun, the same narrator is identified by the name Diacona. That's an anagram of Cyrano D. For the sake of clarity, I'll address the character in both of Cyrano's voyages as Diacona, but make no mistake, even though they sometimes have different viewpoints or philosophies, Diacona is just another mask that Cyrano wore. Cyrano even sometimes signed his name as Diacona in his final days. The novel opens with the full moon, and some friends trading humorous interpretations of it. It's an eyepiece through which you can view the gods. No, it's an eyepiece for the sun to peer through at us to see what we do when he isn't there. Diacona speaks up. It's a world just like ours. His friends laugh at him. And, Diacona adds, I'll bet there are people up there right now laughing at their friend for suggesting that Earth is a world like theirs. And his friends laugh even harder. And so Diacona resolves himself to go there himself to prove it. The book contains many charming descriptions of spaceflight, such as standing on a magnet and throwing an iron ball over one's head, but none are more charming than his bottles of morning dew, which, when strapped to himself and the dew is evaporated by the sun, only manages to fly him to Canada. From there, in a barrel strapped to several sets of fireworks, he finally finds himself spaceborne, in a craft that sci-fi author Arthur C. Clarke will later declare the invention of the multi-stage rocket. And when he lands on the moon, he finds himself in... oh. Right, there's a line from the Moon Man scene in the play that references this. Cyrano says, Someday I shall write the whole thing in a book. The small gold stars that have stuck to my cloak will serve as asterisks on the printed page. This is the first of many omitted passages. Unfortunately, in order to print the book at all, Lebray had to work with the publisher, Circe, to heavily censor it, lest the two of them face punishment for printing blasphemy. An entire 1/5 of Cyrano's writing was removed, sometimes replaced by asterisks, and for 250 years, no one knew what was behind the stars. Until 1920, when Lachèvre found the original manuscript and restored it, which you can now happily read for free, uncensored, on Project Gutenberg. So when Diokhana lands on the moon, he finds himself in the one and only Garden of Eden, landed in none other than the Tree of Life, an apple smashed in his face, reviving him from his rough landing. He meets the prophet Elijah, and is so struck by his youthful beauty, he nearly begins worshipping him. Elijah tells him to cut that out, then tells him the history of the garden, but Diokhana cannot stop himself from interrupting with a naughty joke or two, inciting the prophet to call him a blasphemer and kick him out. As he's being led to the gate, Diokhana stealthily swipes an apple from the Tree of Knowledge and takes a bite. The toxic rind causes him to immediately black out, but the juice from the fruit causes him to slowly wake again, and he finds himself now in the country of the moon proper. He meets the Selenians, the people of the moon, giants who walk on all fours and speak in song and sign language and use poetry as currency. He's immediately misidentified as a monkey, and a female one at that, and brought to the royal family as a gift, where he's put in a cage with not a monkey, but a Spaniard. It's Domingo Gonzalez, the main character from The Man in the Moon. The royal family has put them together in the hopes that they'll breed to make more monkeys, and Diokhana is suspiciously lacking in any form of complaint. This has long been interpreted as an inside joke for Cyrano's friends, who would have surely known what his sexual preferences were. This man literally said, "I wish my blorbos from my sci-fi novellas would breed me." The Moon Queen regularly feels Diokhana's belly, and when he fails to become pregnant and learns the language of the Selenians, he's instead perceived as a plucked parrot. The princess comes to visit him while he's caged, and, in one of the more earnest sections of the otherwise comedic novel, they philosophize over the futility of war. After all, Cyrano the war veteran would know. And when Diokhana tells them that he comes from their moon, that is, Earth, and that it's a world just like theirs, and that this world orbits Earth, they put him on trial, in a clever parody of the trial of Galileo. He receives the same punishment as Galileo, forced to never speak of it again, and only to say that the Earth orbits the moon. He also promises the council that someday he'll publish the story of his moon travels back home on Earth. What follows then is a happy journey around the moon, observing the local customs as he describes mechanisms like audiobooks, record players, and earbuds. The greeting on the moon is, "Love me, sage, for I have loved you." Their farewell is, "Songez à librement vivre." Remember to live free. There's also a great tribute to Big Noses, just in case you forgot who I am and that we've been talking about Cyrano de Bergerac, but I'll talk about this tribute in a later section. In their topsy-turvy world, the young are shown the utmost respect, and their elders serve them, the reasoning being that the young were never asked if they wanted to exist in the first place. By the way, this is a good 200 years before Søren Kierkegaard would ask,
Hvorfor bliver jeg ikke adspurgt?
The young Selenians find their elderly parents to be burdensome, a clear reflection of Cyrano's attitudes towards his own father. As fun as this story is, Cyrano really enjoys name-dropping his friends and favorite philosophers and physicists, and writes long, one-sided philosophical conversations with every character Diokhana runs into. While most of these conversations are a fascinating insight into the exciting and rapidly evolving scientific world of the 17th century proto-science that Cyrano was surrounded by, they not only tend to drag on, but it's also clear that Cyrano is no scientist himself. He's a poet who hung out with scientists. But the true brilliance of the work is how Cyrano manages to create a sort of plausible deniability by giving his true author's opinion not to his narrator, but to the person he's talking to, and allowing Diokhana to respond with a canned good boy response. Except for the bit in the Garden of Eden, of course. This way, if anyone in the real world interrogated Cyrano about his views, he could say that he obviously shares his views with the narrator. It's those silly moon people that think backwards. This, of course, didn't stop it from being censored, though. This novel isn't by any means a masterpiece. It's obvious that this is Cyrano's first time writing a novel, but the tone is cheerful and playful with plenty of wordplay, and you can practically hear the smirk in his written voice as the skeptic questions everything around him. Voyage to the Moon actually has two endings depending on what version you read. The original manuscript ending involves a hilariously abrupt Satan ex machina, but the ending of the first publication is gonna give me another bout of melancholy, huh? The last paragraph was clearly written while Cyrano was dying. First, some quick background knowledge. Cyrano had some manuscripts that were stolen from him while he was ill, the original manuscript of Voyage to the Sun, and another called The Story of the Spark. Let's see what the last paragraph says.
On my way home, I began writing my memoirs from my time on the moon. And when I returned home, I put them in as much order as the illness that keeps me in bed allows me. But foreseeing that this will be the end of my work, to keep my word to the Council of the Moon, I asked Monsieur Lebray, my dearest and most sacred friend, to give them to the public, with The Voyage to the Sun, The Story of the Spark, and some other works, if those who stole them from us return them to him, as I implore them with all my heart.
Return them to him. Cyrano knew he wouldn't be around much longer. The original manuscripts to Voyage to the Sun and Story of the Spark have never been found. But I promise you, we keep looking. As a result, Lebray had to cobble together Voyage to the Sun from unfinished copies, and it would be another 5 years before another book would grace the bookshelves of Paris. A book which, unfortunately, does not have an ending, had to be censored as Voyage to the Moon was, and has never been able to be uncensored. Like any good sequel, Voyage to the Sun feels like a more sophisticated novel than The Moon, without losing its identity. Where Moon was mainly dialogic, Sun contains more narrative sequences, descriptive scenes ranging from the comical to the reverent, with more normal, slightly less rambly conversations. Voyage to the Sun begins right where the original manuscript for Voyage to the Moon left off. Diocanes has landed back on Earth and arrives in Toulouse. He tells the story of his travels to his nobleman friend, de Colignac, who implores him to publish his tales in a book. Remember, Cyrano had already finished writing Voyage to the Moon about a decade ago now and circulated it amongst his friends, but had a feeling he'd face trouble if he published it. What follows is how he imagines this would have played out. When Diocanes finally publishes his Voyage to the Moon, all of Toulouse is up in arms about this blasphemous novel. De Colignac suggests that they leave town until the heat dies down, but Diocanes tells him to go ahead so he can pack a mule with some books. As Diocanes rides his horse alone through town with the mule in tow, he's met by all of the townsfolk ready to ambush him. They shove him off his horse, tie him up, and then look through his books, finding a copy of Physics by René Descartes. You see, Descartes had died shortly before Cyrano started writing Voyage to the Sun. When the book falls open to the drawings of the orbits of the planets around the sun, the panicked townspeople declare them to be demon summoning circles, and immediately take Diocanes to jail. In his cell, Diocanes attempts to convince his jailer by bribing him and saying that an angel came to him, that he needs to be taken to the church tomorrow morning for the sake of his soul. The jailer complies and even removes Diocanes' shackles upon entering the church. As soon as his jailer's back is turned, Diocanes is already out the door and sprints out of town. What follows is a comical cat-and-mouse game, with Diocanes masquerading as a beggar, then as a sufferer of the plague, before blending in with a mob of people who inadvertently lead him to the local prison, where he's swiftly identified and arrested.
They had not far to go to my cell.
Diocanes tries to bribe his way into one of the nicer cells, but his money was taken from him during his arrest. His jailer responds,
"Do you think your lovely nose? Hey, off with you! Into the black dungeons!"
His jailer then hits him in the head with his heavy ring of keys, and Diocanes tumbles down the stairs to the dungeon and is kicked into the black pit. Okay, not only are there multiple references to head injury in Voyage to the Sun, the Black Dungeons bit feels a little too real. The torturous pitch darkness is vividly described and with such genuine terror that the common interpretation is that this could have been Cyrano's own experience during his long captivity.
I am completely unable to express the remainder of it. It surpasses all belief, and I dare not attempt to recollect it. So much do I fear that my present certainty of having escaped this prison may turn out to be a dream from which I shall awake.
After some time, de Colignac arrives, and though he can't set our hero free, he can at least pay for a better cell at the top of the tower. He brings Diocanes books and materials, and Diocanes does what anyone would do in this situation. He escapes from prison by building a spacecraft and flying to the sun. It's a wooden box with a glass bulb on top and a sail on the side. Don't ask me how it works. Something vacuum. I don't think even Cyrano knew how it worked. Also, somehow the heat of the sun doesn't hurt him. As he gets closer to the sun, he finds that he's now receiving energy directly from it, such that he doesn't need to eat or drink or even sleep. And at one point, he realizes that he and his craft have become completely transparent and describes his internal organs. The world of the sun has two sides, the transparent and the opaque. On the transparent side, he meets a kingdom of small polymorphic gemstone folk who form the body of a large, beautiful young man.
He remained some time looking at me, and then, as if he were grown familiar by looking, he approached me, caressed me, and gave me his hand.
Quick reminder that Cyrano never describes any of his female characters this way. On the opaque side of the sun, he meets a phoenix, and then we run into a censored passage just as the phoenix starts talking about being intersex. With Voyage to the Moon, we've seen that the censored passages are only in regards to blasphemy, so I can only imagine that Cyrano implied that God is intersex here. Much too sexy of an idea for the 1600s, apparently. Anyway, Dyrkena eventually happens upon the kingdom of birds, and, you guessed it, they throw his ass in jail. This is now Dyrkena's third time being imprisoned in 2 books. It's a common trope in the writings of the libertines to face constant persecution no matter where they go. They put him on trial for the crime of being human, to which Dyrkena responds, "I'm obviously a monkey," but these birds are too clever, and so sentence him to a sad death. But a parrot comes to his rescue. It's his cousin's former pet, Caesar, who says that Dyrkena always treated him with kindness. And so the birds release him, and now he's free to wander the sun as he pleases. He heads to a forest where he can hear the trees talking amongst themselves. They ask if he'd like to hear the story of the lover trees, and then Dyrkena throws himself onto his knees and begs to hear the story. Cyrano is so excited to tell the reader the story of the lover trees. He combines the Greek story of Orestes and Pylades, and the Roman story of Nissus and Euryalus, and writes the most romantically charged and poetic passages in any of his works. The story of 2 men so heavily wounded in battle. One faces a mountain of enemies just to get to the other, to give his lover one last kiss before the 2 die. From their corpses grow 2 intertwined trees, and when 2 people eat the fruit from these trees, they fall in love. That's right, Cyrano is once again writing queer fanfiction. From this, he tells the story of Hermaphroditus, as well as Iphis and Ianthe, and Cyrano is sure to mention the transgender interpretation of the story as well. He also brings up the downsides of these fruits, mentioning other stories from Greek mythology involving incest or bestiality, such as the case of the Bull of Minos. But this feels like Cyrano's way of finally getting to write about other forms of sexuality in the only way that a person from 1600s Paris can. Let me read you a thing that Dr. Alcover wrote about Cyrano real quick. The essential thing is the spirit that marks all of his work. His testimony in favor of homosexuality is accompanied by a radical rebellion. Unlike others, I don't see in these works any sign of guilt. Do they think that one cannot be homosexual without feeling guilty? One can, but one must get rid of the norm, because the norm invents the margin. He did not experience his homosexuality as a transgression, which would have condemned him to a very unhappy conscience. He gave up sacrificing himself and feeling guilty by deconstructing the system that excluded him. Once the trees conclude the story, they inform Dyrkena that they've received word that their forest is on fire and is quickly spreading, and they urge him to leave, which he does, but not without hesitation. Upon exiting the forest, he meets the philosopher Campanella, the author of the utopian novel The City of the Sun. Dyrkena is delighted to hear that Campanella is on his way to the land of the philosophers to talk with René Descartes, and that he can come along. This excites Dyrkena as he's been reading physics. If you remember, the townspeople of Toulouse thought the book had demon summoning circles in it. But along the way, Dyrkena sees a dying man on the side of the road. He describes the man's head as swollen and split open. As the dying man moans in agony, Dyrkena weeps. He is seeing his own author. But Cyrano, in his dying yet undying sense of humor, still has one last joke in him. Campanella tells Dyrkena,
"This manner of dying is that of great geniuses. It's called bursting with wit."
God damn it. Panache. Like I mentioned, this book is unfortunately unfinished. In fact, it ends right as they reach the land of the philosophers, just as Descartes starts talking. And though it's of course sad that we don't know how the story was supposed to end, there's something poetic about it ending here. I feel like my melancholic state isn't really helping to sell the otherwise happy, playful, joyous tone these novels have. Cyrano has a glowing sense of sarcastic humor and wordplay, and he beautifully describes the worlds Dyrkena visits and the paradoxes he encounters. Rereading his Voyages was such a joy for me in the darkest months of winter. For me, part of the charm of this series is the mental image of a 17th century duelist in space. It's so anachronistic, and yet, somehow, there's no more natural a place for someone like Cyrano. This entire time I've been talking about him, I'm sure you've been wondering, where did all of this fuss about Cyrano's nose come from? We've been so inundated with the exaggeratedly clownish images of his nose that the few actual portraits we have of him are almost underwhelming. It could nearly be called a smear campaign if it didn't take place so slowly over a quarter of a millennium. Let's take a look at what the man himself said about it.
"This authentic nose arrives everywhere a quarter of an hour before his master. 10 cobblers, of reasonable roundness, go to work underneath, sheltered from the rain.
Though this line is spoken about a character in his play Le Pendant Joué, one has to wonder if maybe he previously heard this in reference to himself at some point. The jailer in Voyage to the Sun points out Diakona's lovely nose, and in Voyage to the Moon, the Selenians have noses so long and pointed they use them as sundials. They tell Diakona that they measure the noses of the infants because
a large nose is a sign over our door that says, "Here lodges a witty, prudent, courteous, affable, generous, and liberal man."
Other than our hero, the first person to comment on his nose comes in 1695 in Menagiana, 4 decades after his death. He calls Cyrano's nose disfigured, and invents the story that he killed 10 people just for looking at him askew, because he couldn't stand to be looked at. I don't know what this man's problem was. He brings up that Cyrano sent a death threat to the actor Montfleury. That's another event from the play that was real, by the way. So I can only assume he was a fan of Montfleury and just really didn't like Cyrano. In 1704, almost 50 years after Cyrano's death, a story started circulating called The Duel of Cyrano and Briochet's Monkey at the Pont-Neuf Bridge. His nose is compared to a parrot's beak, and a group of rascals give him a hard time about it. The story is regularly attributed to de Saussy, but by this point he'd been dead for nearly 30 years, so nobody knows for sure. Then, over a century later, from the UK of all places, an anonymous reviewer of Cyrano's letters not only mentions his nose being somewhat awry, also repeats the story of Cyrano dueling on account of it. In 1856, back in France, Gautier features him in a book titled The Grotesques, and in a bizarrely over-the-top and weirdly racist narrative, massively exaggerates Cyrano's nose. There's no doubt that Rostand read this Grotesques. So it's really just something that got blown literally out of proportion. And that's the history lesson. I wouldn't be surprised if Cyrano had been mocked in his time for his appearance, and I certainly wouldn't be surprised if it did start with de Saussy either, but it's such a shame that that's what he's remembered for. As Addyman writes, the tragedy of the real Cyrano is that, despite his extraordinary independence of mind, his heroic courage, his sharp wit, his unfailing good humor, and his riotous creativity, he's generally only remembered as the chap with the nose. Other than the nose thing, in the years after Cyrano's death, outside of his circle of friends, he was largely remembered as a madman. At the time, it was becoming less accepted to straight up kill people for being atheist, so the church switched tactics and instead denounced non-believers as being mad. At one point, de Saussy will be imprisoned in Rome, where he'll be interrogated about his own atheism, and he'll throw Cyrano's corpse under the bus and assert that, if anyone, he was the truly mad one. But in doing so, he brings up an interesting anecdote about Cyrano. Quoting Addyman's translation of de Saussy's account of Cyrano, he had such a powerful imagination that there was nothing neither so ridiculous nor so extravagant that he would not consider as an unassailable truth. And he was not content with being entirely convinced if others were not also as convinced as him. He wanted everyone to believe that each star is a world, and that on top of that, there were an infinity of others, and that there were numerous suns, and no matter what I fed him, he would quarrel with me and would not have thought twice about breaking off with me if I did not agree to allow that there was a world in the moon. I think de Saussy's story here about Cyrano is probably the most earnest thing he's ever written. Unlike every other story he tells about Cyrano, this one feels the closest to reality. But I mean, was Cyrano wrong? It depends what exactly he meant by world, but in general, he's right. And Cyrano needed de Saussy to be as convinced as himself so that he could be sure that it was real. When someone questions not just the religion or the established order, but everything around them in such a manner that Cyrano did, it's not too hard to slip into a nihilistic downward spiral. I can see Cyrano needing to believe in something, so why not life on other planets? Why not dream about utopian worlds where poets don't have to sell their souls just to survive? Why not dream of something better? Other stories abound of Cyrano being mad. One person recalled that they saw him at morning mass still in his pajamas, complete with a nightcap. Another states, when he wrote his Voyage to the Moon, I think he had 1/4 of the moon in his head. Even Voltaire, who was born 40 years after Cyrano died, would summarize him simply as a madman. I don't think Cyrano was mad, in the sense that he was suffering from a neurological disease. I think he was maladjusted. I think he was a smart and sensitive child who was either neglected or abused by all of the adults around him so that he came to despise authority. I think he saw firsthand the horrors of an incredibly brutal war while he was still a teenager, undoubtedly held dying comrades in his arms, and was severely wounded himself. so he without a doubt suffered from PTSD. I think that even if his father was good at handling money, he wasn't. Cyrano still wouldn't have learned how to manage money because his father wasn't interested in teaching him anything, so he never learned how to fend for himself. I think that whenever he felt the need to defend himself or his friends or his honor, which was often, he resorted to unyielding violence so that others came to fear him. I think he had a brilliant and vibrant imagination that was fed by some of the greatest philosophers, mathematicians, and physicists of his time. I think that he felt ultimately constrained and restricted by the society he lived in and the religion he lived under, so that he acted out in ways that others couldn't help but perceive as blasphemous, or even mad. And I think that his voyages were his escape, his chance to combine science and romance, to combine all of the works of his favorite philosophers and his friends with his own imagination, to be able to go someplace different, where the states and empires and their laws are topsy-turvy. He dreamt of a myriad of different worlds because he so desperately wanted to be there, anywhere but where he was. And his final destination, the land of the philosophers of the sun, was Cyrano's personal heaven. How do you get there? Diacono asked Campanella. Is your soul judged by some stuffy angel? No, replied Campanella. Eventually, everyone goes there. As I mentioned before, Cyrano's original manuscripts for Voyage to the Sun and Story of the Spark haven't been found. But, in 2021, a 17th century manuscript appeared at an auction house that was originally theorized to be an unreleased play of Molière's. After examining the kind of paper, ink, the handwriting, and the style of writing, they concluded, well, who else could it be? A previously unknown play of Cyrano's, The Art of Persuasion. Cyrano moved around Paris a lot, and he often had manuscripts go missing, probably because he left them in a trunk at a previous residence. Who knows what could be found next? Like I said, we keep looking. You might find yourself actually kind of hating Rostand and his play for turning this queer counterculture rebel into a straight lovesick clown. Well, straight. Everyone who's ever seen that play knows he's a bisexual disaster. Listen, the reality is, you and I wouldn't be here discussing Cyrano if it weren't for the play. He would have simply fallen into obscurity and no one would have done over a century's worth of research on him. If he was remembered at all, it would have been as a footnote in the history of science fiction. Yes, there are deviations from reality in the play, but I believe that Rostand was doing his best with the limited information that he had. Okay, there was a biography out about him by Pierre-Antonin Brun 4 years before the play, and around the same time as the release of the play, there was a novel called Captain Satan, or The Adventures of Cyrano de Bergerac, a completely original story. Well, except that it lifted that silly cat-and-mouse chase scene in Toulouse from Voyage to the Sun, with love. All that aside, most agree that Rostand managed to capture the spirit of Cyrano, and every time the play is performed, I guarantee you at least one person walks away from it opening up Wikipedia and learning about the real man. Brilliant writer, brilliant fighter, bravery, pride, humor, panache. And from this play and the subsequent surge of research, the name Savinien de Cyrano de Bergerac would live again, for Cyrano was now a legend. In this last section, I wanted to go over what everybody's been up to since all of this hullabaloo, some of the works that Cyrano has appeared in or inspired since the play. Sometimes he appears as the grotesque guy in love with his cousin, but as time goes on, more and more creators are getting him closer to the original, and his story continues to evolve, our own love letters to the person that inspired us for centuries. There's a humble set of lunar craters on the far side of the moon named after him, alongside his contemporaries like Descartes and Gassendi. Oh, they got his birth year wrong. Someone at NASA, can you fix this, please? It should be 1619, thank you. For the longest time, people believed that Cyrano really was a Gascon, even a nobleman, that he really was from the town of Bergerac. The shocking revelation that he was born in and hardly ever left Paris, and that the only nobility he was entitled to was the nobility of his heart, didn't change the minds of the town of Bergerac, who treat him as their favorite adopted son. It's the tourism. There's a good 2, maybe 3 statues of him around town. My personal favorite is the maybe third one, titled Total Disillusionment. There's also a bust of him in Sannois where he passed away, alongside countless cafes, restaurants, hotels, theaters, and other such establishments with his name. His voyages were massively inspirational for Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon, as well as Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. More recently, the play has gotten a fresh coat of paint by playwright Martin Crimp, who worked to modernize it a bit and add an element or two that I think most of us have been wanting to see. I won't say anything else, just find a way to see the Martin Crimp adaptation of the play. But in keeping with Cyrano's own self-tradition, creators have put his character in various other situations, whether it be the stage Cyrano, the real Cyrano, or someone in between. Because after all, the first person to fictionalize Cyrano was Cyrano. He makes a cameo in the 1963 adventure novel Glory Road by Robert A. Heinlein. Here, Cyrano is known as Neverborn, the eater of souls and guardian of the phoenix egg, essentially the final boss of the novel as a fearsome swordsman.
This man's eyes were merry and proud. "Are you a Christian?" he demanded. "What's it to you?" "Nothing. Blood's blood either way. But I'm sentimental. I like to know what I'm killing. I'm American." Is that a country or a disease?
Getting harder to tell, Neverborn. Another Heinlein, sort of. This one is exclusive to the film Starship Troopers.
But Cyrano... shit. Cyrano. Go bug Mom, Cyrano.
Cyrano is a major character in the sci-fi series Riverworld by Philip Jose Farmer, again as a fearsome duelist, having wooed the wife of American author Mark Twain. In a slightly different role, he bookends the film The Fabulous Baron Munchausen, a surreal and gorgeous Czech movie, inspired by Cyrano's voyages and Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon. In it, Cyrano acts as a custodian of the moon, welcoming the astronaut from Earth, and declares the moon is for all lovers. Hey, go watch this movie. Every single frame is a masterpiece. You can watch it on archive.org. So I Am Glad was the most bizarre novel I read last year. The protagonist is a Scottish lady who gets a mysterious new amnesiac housemate who eventually realizes he's been dead for centuries and is somehow alive again out of nowhere. And you'll never guess who he is! Also, his bodily fluids glow in the dark for some reason. Mostly this book just ended up being a fascinating and well thought out character study.
I was just the monster of bravery. I had an agreement with God. I would kill anyone who had an intention to kill me.
The man reflects on his violent past life, and then puts on a Carhartt jacket and digs holes in the garden. He's afraid of cars and thinks bicyclists are acrobats. He feels naked and vulnerable at a bar without a sword.
There is no one in here I couldn't take. I know there's no one here faster than I would be. There is no one here I could not halt. Completely.
But this is the first in a genre I see come up fairly often on the topic of Cyrano. Thought experiments of bringing him into the modern world. Nearly every Cyrano biography mentions something like, he probably would have felt way more at home and at ease in today's world where he could freely voice his thoughts. Donald Webb does this in his notes on Voyage to the Moon, making him take a bath first, and then taking him to the doctors for a checkup, seeing the wall chart of the circulatory system, and getting to peer through a microscope at cells, to which he is fascinated, but not surprised, because he's already on the right track. It also helps that he was so forward-thinking. Many of the thoughts he presents in his voyages and letters feel strangely modern. This is undoubtedly because he was friends with some brilliant mathematicians, but his open-mindedness is all his own. He wouldn't dismiss anything as witchcraft as easily as others from his time period. The tabletop role-playing game system Pathfinder has a swashbuckler class with its special mechanic Panache, with discussions on Reddit talking about what subclass Cyrano would be. Where have I seen this guy before? There's even been some Cyrano name drops in video games, such as the swashbuckling action game On Guard, and the sci-fi thrillers Moons of Madness and Cyrano Story, as well as an entire Cyrano video game itself based on the play, with turn-based combat and poem-building mechanics. But most of all, I wanted to highlight my most favorite one, a novel by the name of Pyrotechnicon, or its full title, Pyrotechnicon, being a true account of Cyrano de Bergerac's further adventures among the states and empires of the stars. What a labor of love this book is. It takes a rumor that Cyrano's missing manuscript of Story of the Spark was actually supposed to be a third voyage, titled Voyage to the Stars, and it just runs with it. Pyrotechnicon opens with a note from the translator, Adam Brown, saying that it is indeed the missing manuscript for the States and Empires of the Stars, and that it was found by a rover under a rock on Mars. Just so you know what we're in for. We're in for some whimsy. The character of Cyrano in Pyrotechnicon is a clever mashup of the swashbuckling stage Cyrano and the philosophical astronaut Diokona. It includes Roxanne and what is essentially a collided timeline of the play, of Cyrano's voyages, and of Cyrano's real life. It opens on the not insignificant date of July 28, 1655, and what follows is the most dreamy, captivating, decadent treat of a science fiction fantasy novel, such that I read the whole thing over the course of 2 days, and when I finished, I immediately started reading it again. And then Kia and I read it together 2 chapters a night as a bedtime story. This is officially my favorite book of all time. Is that because of a Cyrano bias? Well, Yeah, but even without that, it's fun. It's heartwarming, it's witty and funny. It's so funny. Brown masterfully manages to emulate the same playful tone of Cyrano's voyages with just as much wordplay, paradoxes, and absurd descriptions of technology and physics. And I'm happy to announce that upon viewing this video, you have all of the prerequisite knowledge required to fully enjoy it right now. Go read it, have fun. With all of this, you have to appreciate Cyrano's versatility. He isn't out of place in either swashbuckling adventures or science fiction. It's been fascinating to trace the history of his story and see its evolution over hundreds of years, and I'm excited to see where it goes next. If for any reason you've made it this far in the video and you're still thinking about how to get revenge or whatever for the murder of some guy 400 years ago, I'll tell you. Live. Create and share the creations of those you love. Inspire and be inspired by others. Go see the play, especially if the name Martin Crimp is mentioned. You won't be disappointed. Then you can be the one at the theater in intermission saying, "Hey, if you like this guy, you should hear about the real guy. There's a YouTube video you should check out." After I finished rereading Cyrano's Voyages and I came back to the script and I had to write about the tragic way that he died, I had a genuine bout of depression. I felt like I lost a friend. My partner Kia, who did all of the great readings in this video, caught me staring into the void from time to time. I want to thank him for his kindness and his patience and his love throughout this whole process. I also want to thank all of my friends in our private Discord server for encouraging me and for putting up with my daily Cyrano info dumping for months on end while I wrote this script. You can unmute my channel now, I swear. This video would have been impossible without the hard work and dedication of every Cyranist that I reference in the bibliography, which I include in the description. Please check it out. It would have been way more difficult to make this video without the free services of Project Gutenberg, Wikipedia, Archive.org, as well as the local library. Please continue to support these services which offer free access to knowledge in these trying times. This video was cobbled together with my own 2 hands using mostly free and open source software. We can live freely by using and supporting the open source ecosystem and free ourselves from the chains of corporate interests. This video was researched, written, recorded, edited, published, and subtitled by me entirely on my own time without being paid because this is my hobby. My channel is not monetized because I'm blessed enough to have the liberty to not really need to, and because the topics I want to make videos about wouldn't net me a big enough audience anyway. So if you found yourself at any point during this video thinking, I need to throw money at this person, consider making a donation to one of the projects I just mentioned or to your local humanitarian community effort. No generative AI was used at any point in the making of this video, and while generative AI has its place in accessibility and the sciences, the current hellscape of chatbots, AI-generated images and videos, and the flooding of search engine results with absolute trash makes me want to take my own voyage to the sun. Finally, I'll leave you with this. Create. Pick up your worst pencil and your worst paper and draw the worst thing you can and enjoy the human act of creation. Write that self-indulgent thing. Draw that AMV that plays in your head whenever you hear that song. Yeah, that song. Cook that grilled cheese sandwich. Sew, knit, or crochet that thing. Read a good book, listen to an audiobook. I have a recommendation. Go for a walk, touch a tree, look at a critter. But most importantly, songez à librement vivre. Remember to live free.